body of knowledge that's, or literature that's relatively new but very important. So if you have a body part that has not moved discretely for some time, then your body schema will have clumped those body parts together. So if you have had a fractured hip and therefore you've walked with not so much hip movement for a period of time, the internal representation of the pelvis and the femur will have been disrupted and clumped as one, maybe also with your lumbar spine. So therefore, from a central nervous system perspective, you can't separate out those pieces. You feed forward to them as a group. The other important thing in terms of voluntary movements that I wanted to point out here is that they require integration of visual, proprioceptive, and postural information. So, how many of you are familiar with this homunculus picture? Yeah? Okay, so I'm going to how many of you have a belief that, you know, we all learnt the homunculus, that what this means is that there is a place in the brain where, let's say, the shoulder, no, let's go for the elbow, right, is represented, and that means that a neuron from that cortex speaks to the elbow to produce isolated elbow movement. How many for you is that the sort of rationale or the clinical representation of the homunculus? Because if it is, that is what we were taught, right? That is what we were taught. That is what was believed, right? It came from experiments where they put electrons on the cortex and they triggered a part of the cortex and saw what body part moved. And when you do that, yes, these body parts move. But in the context of movement, right, we now know absolutely categorically that there is not a cortical neuron that represents the elbow that is wholly and solely responsible for movement of that one body part, right? Instead, as is written in the text there, the motor cortex has this mosaic of representation. So our body part is represented in many places. And what they've so a cortical neuron actually speaks from cortex, spinal cord down to many muscles, right? Just as A1 muscle receives from many parts within the cortex. So there's both divergence and convergence between the cortex and the musculature. Right? The important thing to note here, though, is that it's not one cortical neuron that creates movement of one muscle or one body part. There's an article that an author called Graziano did a really excellent piece of work. I think it was in the early 2000s. And they took monkeys and they looked at the imaging of the cortex of the monkeys when they performed certain tasks. And what they found was that when they stimulated a particular part of the cortex, they got a particular behavior, right? And they got that behavior irrelevant of the motivational state of the monkey, so whether the monkey was awake or asleep, or the posture that the monkey was in. So there were certain places they could stimulate that always allowed the monkey to bring the hand to the mouth. Whether when they stimulated the hand was, well, it wasn't the hands, maybe not quite right, but the paw was behind or out to the side, or they were climbing the ladder, or they were sitting down eating. Right? But so they essentially saw that a part of the cortex produced a behavior, a task, as opposed to speaking to one muscle. This is looking at inputs to the motor cortex. So the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, receives inputs from, these are the premotor areas, right, involved in motor, involved in motor planning, as well as from the somatosensory cortex, right, where it sends information, proprioceptive information about the musculature that is then going to receive the descending information, as well as the parietal cortex. And then the areas of the premotor cortex, which is represented here, they get information from the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex. Now, if all that's lots of words are bits of the cortex, which in a way it is, the important message is that for the primary motor cortex to fire in normality, when we're not dissected and disconnected, or when we don't just have an electron on the outside of the brain stimulating it, there has to be this number of inputs flood into the motor cortex to bring it to threshold. Right? And those inputs are diverse. They include somatosensation, right, from the sensory cortex. They include working memory from the prefrontal cortex. They include motor planning from the premotor cortex. But it's a summation of inputs that brings the motor cortex to threshold to then make the descending systems come on to produce the movement. Not only is it a conversation within the cortex, but there are these cortical subcortical loops, right? So there is connections between the cortex and the basal ganglia, which is the blue here, and the cortex and the cerebellum. And these connections, as you can see, are like loops. Oh, they're not like loops, they are loops, right? But what you have to imagine is it's almost like getting a machine going. To get the primary motor cortex to fire, for the descending systems to create movement, there needs to be this incredible convergence of input from other areas of the cortex, as well as from other subcortical structures. So therefore, when you're demanding of movement, the environment, the alignment of the body parts, the alignment of the joints, the length of the muscles, right, the motivational state of that patient to perform that goal, the memory of having done it before, etc., all play in to how they produce that movement. Right. The classic examples, oh no, I won't go there. I won't go there because it was an arm example. I'm not meant to talk about arms like that. Now this is again just another way to break your idea that there's only one piece of the cortex speaking to one muscle. So the corticospinal system is one of the descending systems. It's the descending system that is known for producing skilled finger movement and specific foot placement. And it is powerful in that it goes from the cortex to the spinal cord. It doesn't stop. There's no train stations. It's the direct line. So you think something, it goes to the spinal cord. Right? It can directly influence the alpha motor neuron. But then there's this little interneuron in here, which is an indirect interneuron. And that indirect pathway means that this cortex spinal cord descending tract can actually play into the interneuronal network within the spinal cord to influence many parts of the body. So even this system that's sort of put on a pedestal as speaking to specificity of skilled movement actually has the capacity to send its message in a broader sense to many muscles and be responsible for multi-joint activity. I just want to spend a few minutes raising the question or the idea in terms of theories of motor control. So this is again, how is movement created? Oh, sorry. The reflexive theory is essentially completely debunked. We're not based as reflexive animals. The hierarchical concept is again really now old-fashioned, that that's the only way the central nervous system operates, that the brain tells the spinal cord to do what it's to do and the spinal cord just does it, and it doesn't have any capacity to say, well, excuse me, in this particular context, I actually think it would be better to move this way. So that the top-down hierarchical concept has really been debunked.